Friends, the gospel this morning is from Mark chapter 9, verses 30 to 37. And as I said to the children, Jesus and his disciples are traveling to a town, and on the way they're arguing about which one of them is the greatest. Then they went from there and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. Jesus sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then Jesus took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Friends, this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So I read this interesting article in the paper this week that suggested that some evangelical, more conservative Christians and their national leaders are beginning to feel powerless in our country. So the story began with the former governor of Kansas, Sam Brownback, gathering in a crowded Christian church in Texas with Christian voters. And he began that meeting asking them how many of them felt discouraged by the current state of politics. And nearly every hand went up. And the article went on to say they just felt like they were kind of losing their influence in the country. And that was curious to me because from my perspective, it seems like evangelical Christians are winning a lot. So they successfully helped to elect Donald Trump, which led to exactly what they wanted, a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court. And as a result, Roe v. Wade was overturned, a long-time goal of conservative Christians, but always something that I think even to them seemed out of reach. And somehow yet they achieved that. There has been of late a renewed effort from Christian leaders to restrict the rights of transgender people. And they've had many, many victories on that front, including right here in Missouri. Their anti-gay agenda is spreading through Christian leaders into African nations with very, very dangerous results. There are states now, I know you've read about this, where the 10 Commandments now need to be posted in schools, and there's mandatory teaching of the Bible. And recently in Alabama, they won a ruling declaring frozen embryos to have the same rights of children. And so many, many conservative Christians have been against in vitro fertilization, and that is now getting threatened. So it seems to me that they still wield a lot of power in our country and are winning a lot. But as this article went on to point out, they're not in control of everything everywhere like they once were. And their brand of Christianity is no longer the dominant religion in the country. Really, Christianity as a whole is sort of slipping from that position. So I suppose even with all those wins, it seems sort of hollow if you're no longer the greatest, if you're no longer the one at the center. So as you know, for nearly a decade now, the Republican Party has adopted the slogan, "Make America Great Again." And I think in some ways the Christian church has been tempted by that same kind of greatness, looking back to the past for greatness. And I just was wondering this week, what would a slogan like "Make the Church Great Again" be like? Not great, but great again. So I think it would likely mean we would return to the days when almost everyone in the country was a Christian and they went to church. And sanctuaries were full to overflowing on Sunday mornings. Sunday school classes were overflowing. There were plenty of resources to build churches like this. And if you look around at how this church was built, it's like no expense was spared. I mean, look at the detail, like on this lectern. No expense was spared. There was no hand-wringing about church growth like there is today. The problem really was always, how do we manage all this growth? And so there were building additions and adding a second and third Sunday morning service and hiring more staff. So churches would have, one or two or three associate pastors, and they would have a hired Christian educator. So wouldn't that be great if we could get back to those days again? But we have to remember that was great for some people, but not for others, not for everyone. So when I was in seminary in the early 1990s, and to me that doesn't seem like that long ago. I know it seems like long ago to some of you. It doesn't seem like that long ago to me. I was in seminary in Decatur, Georgia, and the slogan of Decatur, Georgia was this: homes, churches, and schools. And they had these cute little signs all over town with a graphic of a house next to a church with a steeple and a cross and a little red schoolhouse. So that was probably great if you were a Christian, but it probably didn't feel great if you were Jewish or Muslim, right? So when the church was the greatest in our country in terms of numbers and influence, it was also the most segregated. This is remarkable to me, but we still had some all-black synods and presbyteries in our denomination into the early 1980s. It wasn't until after reunion that those were finally dissolved. The gifts of women for ministry were first denied, and then when we allowed the ordination of women as both elders and deacons and as pastors, the gifts were often ignored. LGBTQI members were at best, second-class citizens, but often driven out of the church. So in short, the church was great for some, I would say largely for white men, but not always great for others. And I think if you look at the history of our nation, the same is true. Great for some, but not always great for everyone. And this is why Jesus has a very dim view of greatness. So if someone has to be on top, right, that means someone else has to be on the bottom. So in today's gospel, Jesus makes another prediction. He did this in the reading last week. Another prediction that he will be betrayed and be killed. So there is, of course, no greatness in that, traditionally speaking. Jesus and his disciples were on the road when he made that prediction, and when they arrived at their destination, he pointedly asked them, "What were you arguing about along the way?" And they didn't answer him because, as you have heard, they were arguing about which one of them was the greatest. And somehow, I think they didn't answer because they knew that Jesus would not approve of that argument. So what's so wrong with being great? Well, it's fine to be really good at something. There's nothing wrong with that. It's fine to have gifts. It's a blessing to share your gifts in community. If one of you is a better cook than another person, we want you cooking for us, that's absolutely fine. But when you start to ask, who is the greatest, now you have started an argument. And being the greatest is about distinguishing yourself from others. It's about division. And the truth is, we get a lot of affirmation for distinguishing ourselves, especially in this culture. If you get the best grade in the class, wow, isn't that wonderful? If you're the first picked for some, sporting thing in school, like kickball, if you're the strongest or the smartest, if you're the most beautiful, if you're the lead salesperson or the employee of the month, or you have the biggest salary, on and on and on. From our youth, we are pushed to distinguish ourselves from others and seek being great so that we get affirmation. We get affirmation, but not from Jesus. For some reason, not from Jesus. So over and over again in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples vie to be the greatest. And each time Jesus rebukes them and rejects the whole idea that one person would be greater than another. So in Mark 10, which is the next chapter, they're at it again. They're vying to be the greatest. And Jesus says to them, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their leaders lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it's not to be that way among you. So the leaders, the great ones, are going to eventually be tyrants. And so, of course, this is in the context of the Roman Empire. And I think what Jesus saw, that for Rome to be the greatest nation on earth, a lot of wonderful things came into being, a lot of wonderful technology. But it also meant that for Jesus' people, they lived their whole lives with a boot on their necks as second-class citizens. So greatness for some meant suffering and poverty and death for others. So what Jesus is saying here is that as people struggle and fight, kick and scratch, lie and cheat to get to the top, we as followers of Jesus can simply look at all of that and say, that's not really for us. We are not interested in being the greatest. We are set free from all of that. So one problem with being the greatest, as I've said, is that we are pitted against each other. And James says this about it in Community: it leads to disorder and wickedness of every kind. And that's exactly right. If we're trying to figure out who's the greatest in community, it's going to lead to disharmony. But another problem is that it really is chasing after the wind. So you may be able to achieve something like greatness at some point in your life, but you cannot hold on to that greatness for very long. So again, look at the example of the Roman Empire, the greatest nation on earth, and what is it now? It's gone. So you can't hold on to greatness forever. So a bit closer to home, consider maybe how greatness works within a family. Eckhart Tolle writes this about the relationship between a parent and child, and I think there's a lot of truth in this. He says, in the human dimension, and for him the human dimension is always temporary, in the human dimension, you are unquestionably superior to your child. So you are bigger, stronger, you know more, you can do more. And if that human dimension is all that you know, you will feel superior to your child, if only unconsciously, and you will make your child feel inferior, if only unconsciously. Of course, our children do not want to feel inferior to us. What they want to feel is loved. So at first, you are greater than your child, as he says. But then as the child grows, the tables are turned. And the tables are turned pretty quickly. Pretty soon, your child is bigger, stronger, knows more, and can do more than you. So by the time our daughters reached high school, both of them could run faster than I could. So that's like 16 years of greatness I had, and then it was gone. So it's a very, very temporary thing. So greatness is always and only on the level of form, on this human level, and so it is always temporary and it's always fleeting. And as such, greatness will never satisfy our deepest longings. The pursuit of being great will always turn ugly for nations, for religions, and in our personal lives. So Jesus does this really interesting thing. He teaches his disciples the folly of wanting to be greatest by bringing a little child into their midst. So part of what Jesus is doing here is setting an example of welcoming the least and the last. we bring the weakest in. We don't dishonor the least and the last. We bring them into the center of community. So that's part of what he's doing. Part of what he's doing, and this is really remarkable, is pointing out the divinity dwelling in each human being, no matter how young or old, how weak or strong. So pay attention to this. This is what he says. When you welcome a child, you welcome me. So when you're welcoming this little child, you're welcoming the Spirit of Christ within that child. And then he says, when you welcome me, you welcome the one who sent me. So you're also welcoming God in that child. You're welcoming the divinity of that child. Whoever you welcome into your midst, whatever human being, you're welcoming the divinity within them. That's remarkable. So that's part of what Jesus is doing there. But I think there's something more here. So he doesn't just welcome the little child into their midst. He takes the child up into his arms. So just take in that image for a moment. A little child sitting in the lap of Jesus. So what Jesus is offering here is more than just a teaching. I think he's offering us a spiritual practice. So when you are tempted by the desire to be the greatest, to be the best, to distinguish yourself over and against others, a remedy is this: take a little child into your arms. Now, don't do this without asking the parents. So, take a little child into your arms, and you are in many ways transformed, right? With a little child in your arms, fragile and defenseless, you begin to think more about the well-being of that child and less about yourself. With a little child in your arms, you become aware of how fragile and how beautiful this life is. With a little child in your arms, it's a lot harder to hit someone, right? It's harder to get into an argument or a physical fight or defend yourself because you might drop her. It's almost unimaginable to lose your temper and pull out a knife or a gun with a little child in your arm. Instead, if you have a child in your arm, you're going to work really, really hard for peace. So give your complete and undivided attention to a little child, and you will begin to learn what really matters in this life. And it has nothing to do with being better than other people. Actually, it is found in becoming more and more connected to other people. So take a little child into your arms, and you can remember how really good this life really is, and you can forget all about being the greatest. Thanks be to God.